Welcome to the NCIA's Voice of Cannabis podcast. Join host Jimmy Young as he dives into the pulse of the cannabis industry, featuring weekly guests who break down big topics like standardization, evolving regulations, and exclusive member spotlights. Get informed, get inspired. And now, here's your host, Jimmy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of the NCIA's Voice of Cannabis podcast. I'm Jimmy Young. This podcast is made possible through the support of the Budge Group Consulting Group out of the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, as well as the Maverick PR firm in Colorado. I'm Jimmy Young, your host. We're so happy to have with us the CEO of FundCanna. His name is Adam Stettner. And this particular interview will have double duty. We'll actually run it on our own network at WPCMTV.com, but also for our Cannabis Coast to Coast News show. And Adam, thank you so much for joining us here today. You have created one of the most successful lending arms in the cannabis industry. And for that, you deserve a prize, because this is not an easy detail at all. And yet you've managed to deliver over... Actually, I'd like to get that number. I hear reports 300, I hear 400 million. How many millions of dollars of loans have you pumped into the cannabis industry since you started FundCanna?
Well, Jimmy, first, thank you for having us on the show. I appreciate it. And then to answer your question directly, we've underwritten about 5,000 transactions. We funded about 3,500 transactions. We've approved close to $500 million, 500 million. And clients have drawn about $225 million so far.
Gotcha. And of course, I did some research, so I saw varying reports. So I figured I'd go right to the source, and I hope you're comfortable with that. Let's start with the news of the week. The Fed dropped the interest rates by 0.25%. What impact will that have on your business?
None. And the reason I say that, I certainly don't mean it dismissively, but I deal with the same thing that the rest of this industry deals with. And the fact that we are all, this is the crazy part. And I think your listeners will be, interested to hear. I'm in a Class A office building, a regular office. I'm surrounded by medical practice and you name it. There is no cannabis anywhere nearby, but we are treated as an institution no differently than the plant-touching clients we service. And so what the Fed does with Fed funds rates, it doesn't really have an immediate bearing on how people borrow, unless they're borrowing at the institutional level, and that is tied to an index. So and if you don't want this for your listeners, please stop me. But you have something called SOFR, secured overnight Fed or finance rate. You've got what used to be LIBOR, and these rates will move in conjunction with Fed fund rates typically. Maybe not directly, but closely aligned. And then institutions will tie your borrowing to the SOFR rate, and they'll peg it, but plus a margin. And as rates move, it might be +3, let's say. And so if you've got SOFR at, let's just call it 4.25, although it's a little higher, but let's call it that, and you have SOFR +3, you'd be paying 7.25. The problem is cannabis doesn't get SOFR. We don't get anything close to that. And so when the Fed cuts rates, it doesn't make a bit of difference for this industry in reality. Now, there's some very, very large MSOs that do $1 billion a year in sales, 800 million a year in sales, that might have a ton of assets, real estate included, and they might have the benefit of institutional capital from a bank that is tied to some kind of Fed-related rate. But for the vast majority, and I mean literally 99% of this industry, that the Fed funds rate is near meaningless. And until we have all of the relief that this industry speaks of often, and I'm sure we'll get into that later, it doesn't have much bearing on us. And as a funding source, that includes us. I don't get my money from a bank because banks won't lend to me, just like they won't lend to this industry.
Right. And again, one of the most unfair, unjust practices. And it's amazing to me that the industry has survived for as long as it has, even during this period of growth. But my goodness, the green rush turned into a green wall very fast. And I guess the follow-up question is, do you expect federal reform, even if it is just a rescheduling as opposed to what the industry really wants, which is a descheduling of the industry to open up a lot of financial opportunities?
So it's a loaded question because I entered this space. I started studying this space in 2020 during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Cannabis was deemed essential. And I won't go deep on this, but just for background, I was fascinated. I was in lending already, first consumer, then commercial. And in 2020, my business was forced to close. Now, we were still operating, but everybody was working from home. I had 250 employees and no one was allowed to leave their house. And then we had at the time about 5,000 active clients active on our books at the time, and none of them were allowed to operate. And while I'm sitting at home wondering how I'm going to run my business, pay my employees, how all of my 5,000 clients are going to operate, there was a news story about how cannabis was deemed essential. And I was fascinated about the fact that something that was viewed as illicit, a Schedule I drug in the eyes of the Fed, Controlled Substances Act, or CSA, with no medicinal value whatsoever, and completely illegal at the federal level, was deemed essential. Right. And regular legal business, and I put quotes around that, was not allowed to function or operate. That led me down the rabbit hole of trying to understand how this all worked. And ultimately, what I learned was it is vastly underbanked. I don't use the term debanked. I use the term underbanked. And I'm explicit in that there are banks that service the space, and the banks that welcome you in the space. Even at the time, back in 2020, there were about 400 banks. Now, granted, that's 4% of the banks that service other industry. But nonetheless, those banks did not turn you away, shut you off. They made you jump through hoops, but they banked you. But this industry has been underbanked always and still is. Now, instead of 400 banks, we have closer to 950, but that's still only about 10% of the banks that bank traditional business. And so I look at like what's going on, and this industry needs more than it has right now. And so any movement of legislation, getting to your question more directly, any movement of legislation will open the gates on the ability, not only for banks, but for all business, for advertising. We can't advertise on Google, will not allow us to advertise. Meta, Facebook, and Instagram, not allow you to advertise. And so we can't market, we can't advertise, we can't borrow. It's difficult to bank. It's more expensive for us to bank, although that's getting much, much better than it was even just 3-4 years ago. And so we need movement. Now, you ask me, what is the possibility or the odds of this? Well, the reason why I went through that whole thing is I entered the space realizing how underserved this industry was, with a desire to create product that would serve the industry. In that time, it has been the most illogical and frustrating series of events. Now, I'm not complaining. I'm just stating facts. Right. I like whatever someone throws at me, and this industry is very much the same. I just take the position and I make the most I can out of it. I always say, people often say it is what it is. And I say, no, that's not true. It is what I make it. And in this industry, you have to figure out how to make something of a very difficult legislative and illogical environment where cannabis is treated like heroin or methamphetamine. You've got fentanyl killing hundreds of thousands of people a year, and that is less regulated in the sense that it is Schedule III. It's still highly regulated, but it's legal.
Right.
Fentanyl is legal and it's killing hundreds of thousands of people. Cannabis is federally illicit and has killed nobody. And so that in itself is illogical. There's not research being done on a plant that plugs in to our system neurologically. And so you don't have research being done. You don't have widespread access. And we have punitive measures at every level, from taxation to banking to interstate commerce to things like I've already mentioned, marketing, advertising, sales, etc. And so it's completely backward and upside down. What are the odds? I have a hard time saying that because of how illogical things are. But what I will say is this. We watched a presidential race where, for the first time in history, we had two presidential candidates speaking about cannabis. It was mentioned relatively frequently by comparison to previous races. In fact, we go back, and in my lifetime, and when I say that, it's not like I'm very young, but when Clinton ran, he was denying use of cannabis by saying he'd never inhaled. Right. Which is laughable. It's pathetic and ridiculous. Of course you inhale. But now you had two candidates that were both saying this is crazy, and 88% of voters want this, according to Pew Research. The shortest measurement would be about 70%. And so if the majority of voters want it, we should give the people what they want. So I think that with Trump having won, and I'm not being political at all, but the way Trump's administration works, when he wants something, he gets it. And there's a little bit less of kind of process. Now, that's good and bad, depending on where you sit. Again, I'm not giving an opinion on that. Very carefully not giving an opinion.
I understand.
But what I will say is, when he says he's going to make a decision soon, when he runs a PSA on a Sunday that speaks to the medical value of cannabis and CBD and hemp, and says a decision is imminent, I have to believe that it's on his mind. And for me, let's just pause there for a minute. The fact that the president is publicly, on a global basis, making announcements about the fact that, in essence, there's medical value to something that is currently scheduled to have no medical value, it is very promising, very promising. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll tell you, it's the minimum that this industry deserves is for rescheduling. And rescheduling would eradicate one of the biggest issues the industry deals with, which is IRC provision 280E, which tells you that because the underlying product is illicit in the eyes of the federal government, you are not allowed to deduct the expenses associated with the revenue that comes from the sale of that product. And therefore, you don't get your write-offs. So your effective tax rate is more like 70 to 80%, where the effective tax rate for normal industry is a fraction of that.
Yeah. And if you go back in history and look at that Tax Act of 1937, they tried to do that. They did the same thing when they created prohibition. Okay. They didn't.
Yeah, they did. But this, you're 100% correct, Jimmy. So I'm not contradicting you. I'll just say 280E was specifically designed to bankrupt industry that was trafficking drugs. Right. And it came from the arrest of a heroin trafficker that had been running legitimate enterprise and moving his money from drug trafficking through those enterprises and getting write-offs for this revenue, in essence, laundering money and getting tax breaks. That is not what this industry does. No. Not even close, remotely close. So they're applying an antiquated, unrelated provision of the IRS or IRC 280E, and they're applying it to state legal business that pays tax, that operates within the letter of the law at the state level based on the Cole memo. And it just makes no sense. It's illogical. It would be like telling someone the speed limit here is 85 and then applying some weird antiquated law that says when horse and buggies couldn't go greater than 8 miles an hour, now you get a fine or a ticket, or you have to pay triple for your gasoline. The two things don't jive.
No. And one of my favorite stats to share with people who, go to the prohibitionist side is I say, let me ask you a question. If you were in a doctor's office and you looked up on the wall and you saw a diploma from Harvard Med, Yale Med, UPenn Med, or NYU Med, the oldest medical schools in our country, you'd feel pretty confident with the advice that you'll get from these doctors. And of course, everybody said, of course. I said, so graduates of those universities and schools from 1900 to 1906 wrote 5 million prescriptions for cannabis as a medicinal product. And then it became vilified. And we can get into the politics of that if you really want, but let's not, because there's still plenty to talk about in reality now.
But fast forward to where we are right now, to your point, and you've got a legal industry in over 40 states. We've got territories as well, but over 40 states, you've got 88% of the voting public wanting this. Mm-hmm. It is less damaging than tobacco, less damaging than alcohol, neither of which are even CSA scheduled. Mm-hmm. And you've got fentanyl and opioids that are legal and get tax breaks, and people addicted to them, and people losing their children and their parents and their siblings to these horrific drugs. And those continue to operate under the letter of legal law, and cannabis doesn't. Now, this industry legally is employing nearly 500,000 people. It has paid $25 billion in taxes already, mm-hmm. and is being hamstrung by these federal laws. And so you think about this as politicians that complain about how the industry skirts the law. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, we would pay a lot more tax if they opened up like this and got rid of IRC 280, because it would compress the illicit market. What we're really doing is we're trying to make up for the shortfalls in mismanaged municipalities and cities and the federal government by overtaxing a new industry that is newly legal and is, even for small towns, creating millions of dollars in tax base. But what they're in essence doing is they're creating 38, 40%, 42% tax rate at the local level for the consumer. And then they're taxing the hell out of the provider nearly 70 to 80%. And all the while you've got an illicit market because of that is a lot cheaper, is paying no tax. So 75% of cannabis sales that occur right now are occurring on the black market because people don't want to overpay and pay 40% tax at the consumer level. And you've got these operators that are struggling to do the right thing, to get licensed, become compliant, do lab testing, child-proof packaging, proper transport, banking, all of these things, and then the tax base that we just talked about. All the while, there's almost no enforcement on the illicit market. So they're enforcing the taxes and the compliance on the legal market, and they're letting the illicit market run wild. Now, if we were to reschedule the drug, it would reduce taxes. Municipalities would realize that there's more opportunity here as the industry grows. They can increase their tax base and their revenue while not overtaxing the consumer and the businesses that are operating legally. And that would squeeze the illicit market and drive more sales back in to the legal market. That's safer, taxed, creates benefits for roads, schools, et cetera. And that's really what we need as an industry. Yeah. It also opens up banking, marketing, and all the other things interstate commerce would be another big one. Now, again, the federal rescheduling doesn't solve all of this, but it certainly is like the giant puzzle piece that enables other pieces to be snapped on around it.
It can be a first step towards more acceptance. And what I continue to preach about is normalization and acceptance of this product, that it's here. It's needs to be studied. We get that. We want to educate the youth of America so that they understand what they'd be getting into. I certainly am not here to preach that we want our young people to use this plant medicine. I use the Robitussin analogy all the time because you have to show an ID to get Robitussin out of the drugstore these days because of dextromethorphan. You get high from that product. So adults only can take it out of a drugstore. Now, I want to talk about state governments for a second, because what I'm starting to see, and I know you are too, that state governments are using cannabis as another pawn, another tool, and they're undoing the will of the people in many cases, in Ohio, in Nebraska, and now there's a movement in Massachusetts and Maine to undo the already existing adult use practices. And it boggles the mind that we've come this far, that the cannabis plant is a political pawn to make up for budget shortfalls and to right the wrongs of what the people wanted. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. And it makes me extremely annoyed and mad.
Well, but it's kind of full circle. It's oftentimes, the angry minority that makes a lot of noise, and then they use either donations or threats for politicians that want to be reelected. And so to your point, that's exactly what it is. It's like a political football that gets passed from one to another. But all the while, you've got, as I said, 500,000 people that are employed by the industry that are getting whipsawed around. You've got operators working to do the right thing and try to provide safe access. And then the very lawmakers that create the laws, they either leave a loophole or they change their mind or they don't realize what they thought they did. And it's all like, we just go back to it. And at the end of the day, and I'm sorry to speak so plainly, but it's all BS. Right. If we just stop and we think about it, if you remove the politics from this, if you remove kind of organizations need to have the evil thing that they need to make noise about to either drive donations, drive media awareness, if you pull the BS out, this is absurd. What's going on is just absurd. And it's only a matter of time. This is not a country where the will of the people can ever be ignored for long. And you go back to our history to the late 1700s and there's not a single example where the will of the people was ignored for long. It's been ignored, and then there's some kind of rise up. Now, I'm not in any way insinuating that that's violent. I'm not saying that there's a revolution at bay. That would be ridiculous. But prohibition is a great example. And you have conservative politicians, Tom Tillis, North Carolina, Republican, very conservative, states plainly, prohibition doesn't work. It didn't work with alcohol, and it's not working with cannabis. Right. So instead of using prohibition as a tool, why don't we figure out, let's take the time, let's study it, let's come up with a framework where we can federally regulate this, and then the states can still do their thing, but follow a federal framework. And that is logical thinking. It may not be what everybody wants. Right. It may not be the fastest. There is no silver bullet, but that's logic at work. You've got a lot of that. You've got law enforcement that says the same thing. And now, again, thankfully, you have a president that is saying it. So I think that the recognition by many politicians, including conservative politicians, the recognition of the will of the people wanting cannabis, and the fact that it isn't what people say. It's not a deadly drug. It doesn't lower IQ. It is not proven to be a gateway drug. So let's stop the noise. Let's stop the BS. And let's just look at how should this work. Let's fix the taxation issue. Let's fix access to banking. Let's fix let's lab testing, child packaging. It should be gated. It should be regulated. It absolutely should. No different than alcohol and tobacco. But stop it. Heroin? Come on. This is so silly.
And now we get to talk about the unregulated business that the federal government defined as hemp, 0.3% THC dry weight, and it's a total unregulated industry. Human behavior figured out a way to get around the cause and actually create a product that you can get a little high from. But again, it's now entered into the beverage industry. I want to know percentage-wise, how many hemp industry companies have you been working with in comparison to the cannabis highly regulated side of things?
Currently, 11% of my portfolio is hemp related. Beverage is growing. I'm a believer. I'm a consumer of beverage. I think it's great. I think it's a hell of a lot better than alcohol. I'd much prefer to have a cannabis derived beverage rather than tequila or beer. And look, if people enjoy alcohol, like again, freedom of choice, whatever you're into, but it's less damaging on my body. I'm not speaking of the science. I just am telling you how it makes me feel. And I know people that have had liver disease, and I know families that have been torn apart by alcoholism. You then look at what's going on. You've got convenience store associations. They want beverage. Why? Fast growing segment. Alcohol use is decreasing. I have a 22-year-old daughter. College age students are drinking less and they're consuming more cannabis. However, there are also fewer fights, less car accidents, less aggressive behavior. And it's not like they're using cannabis all day long. They're using cannabis in lieu of alcohol. So when they go out to be social, they may use some cannabis. So I think the beverage, Total Wine, Circle K, these are companies that have made announcements. I'm not breaking news, that they're expanding the offerings. Target is testing cannabis beverage, again, hemp derived, intoxicating cannabis beverage. So I think that, look, there is limited science, but that's just because of the federal law. But there is science about CBD and hemp and reduction of inflammation. And I'm by no means an athlete, but I'm very active. I run, I exercise, I go to the gym every day. CBD, both topically and via ingestion, has helped me tremendously. And the fact that it's hard to get is crazy. And so again, I don't want to digress, and most of your listeners know what we're speaking about, but it is something that I believe in. It's something that we continue to fund. Now, lately, with some of the noise that we're hearing in certain states, we have to be very careful. The last thing I want to do is extend capital to a business that only operates in a given state. But given the current framework, and we have a federal government that is being lobbied to close the hemp loophole, and I put air quotes for those that might just be listening. But to close, now that might not have been Mitch McConnell's intent when he wrote the 2018 Farm Bill, but it shows you what people want, and it shows you the benefit of having this product accessible. So the idea of closing access to the thing that people want. What happened during Prohibition? Alcohol went underground. Right. What happened? It got stronger. People made moonshine in the woods.
Right.
This is ridiculous. So when companies like Target, Total Wine, Circle K say, this is what our clients want, this is what we want to offer, the industry, and they're amazing companies like Vertosa that do science on the plant to provide access to the underlying ingredients that are needed by an industry. But what are we doing? Why would we want to throttle that? Instead, I'm all for regulation, thoughtful, logical framework, regulation, and then let's wisely grow the industry. That makes sense.
It does make sense. Recently, you launched ReadyPaid, a platform that can move the industry away from just cash transactions. How has that rollout been going for you guys?
Well, and I appreciate you asking. And what I'll say is there are two, not as a commercial, but just for the basics for listeners to understand. We offer two products, neither of which are really offered by banks. And that's an issue for this industry. Normal, and I say normal again with a dose of gallows humor, normal industry, non-cannabis business, they have access to revolving lines of credit from banks. They have access to factoring. Now, banks decline small business at a rate of 75 to 80%. Nothing to do with cannabis. You own a restaurant, you own a retailer outside of cannabis, you're being declined 8 out of 10 times by the very bank that services you for your deposits. In cannabis, that number is basically zero on approvals. And so our core product acts like a revolving line of credit. And that is the majority of what we've done since early 22. The ReadyPaid product, one of the issues this industry deals with is delinquent accounts receivable. And why is that? The industry started where everything was COD, again, because it was underbanked. Right. Cash was moving around. In order for you to buy from me, I don't know what your banking situation is. I don't know what your books look like. I don't know when I'm going to get paid. So if you want product from me, I'm a cultivator, I'm a manufacturer, you pay me when you take the product. That evolved to net 30 terms, which said, okay, I'll give you the product now and I'll give you 30 days to pay me. That spawned a bunch of delinquent accounts receivable. Why? Two reasons. The first is sellers of any product, they're not experts in credit. They're not underwriting the buyer of that product. So they're giving product to someone that they believe wants it and will sell it, and they believe or hope that they'll get paid back. But they didn't do diligent underwriting. They just gave the product, crossed their fingers, and 30 days later hoped they would get paid. Well, without underwriting, there's a chance you won't. But the other issue, and I believe the bigger issue, is the revenue cycle for the cannabis industry averages, I'm not saying it's definitive, but it averages from cultivator through dispensary. So the entire supply chain averages somewhere between 4 and 5 months. Yep. So you have to pay in full after 30 days, but it takes you anywhere from 120 to 150 days to derive your revenue. And so how are you supposed to pay on time when you don't have your cash flow? So what ReadyPaid does, and the reason we designed the product after being in the industry for 3 years, because we were watching this disparity of cash outlay and revenue or cash income, and is we underwrite the buyer, and that's what we're great at. We're not great at cannabis supply chain, but I worked very hard to understand the cannabis supply chain. So we underwrite the buyer, we pay the seller on day one. They don't even have to wait 30 days. And then at day 30, the client can either pay under net 30 terms, no cost, no payment for 30 days, just like it used to work with the seller. Or if they want to take advantage of extended terms, we'll put them on weekly installment payments for an additional 6 months. And so what it does is we align cash outlay with the inflow of their revenue. And now they can sell product, and as the product gets sold, they can pay for the product that they've purchased. But the seller has their cash flow right away. So the seller can take that, pay their employees, pay their suppliers, and start their cycle of producing again right away, rather than dealing with a delinquent book of receivables, chasing buyers that are not in a position to pay. So we pay the sellers right away, and then we give the buyer time to pay for the goods they've purchased. And that timeline aligns with their revenue cycle. Right. Hopefully that made sense.
No, it doesn't. In fact, I'm going to congratulate you on identifying a problem in the industry and then coming up with a solution that you can go to the market with. And that means you actually care about the industry, which I respect beyond. So I congratulate you and FundCanna on what you've accomplished so far. And we both know we still have a long way to go. But when I read a quote from the country of Colombia is telling President Trump on a Twitter post that he should legalize cannabis. And, we lived to see the day we had 2 presidential candidates doing it. I'm now seeing the Colombian president, and I'll admit I probably, put a little cash into their economy over the years, let's just say. That being said, I actually lived to see the day where he's now telling the president of the United States that he should legalize this plant and allow exports to come in and all this. And good for him for doing that. We've come a long way, Adam. We still have a long way to go. But having clear-minded people like yourself involved, I feel much better now. I really do. And I appreciate you taking the time to, again, kind of just say the same things that I've been thinking and knowing, and you're far more successful than I am, but you get it. You get it. And actually, and communicating that now to the world is our biggest challenge. And I'm more than willing to continue to wave that flag. And I appreciate so much you taking the time out of your day to join us here, not just for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, but also for the Voice of Cannabis, the NCIA's podcast. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Anytime. I'd love to be here again.
Well, that'll do it for another edition of the NCIA's Voice of Cannabis podcast. I'm Jimmy Young, the host, and I want to thank our supporters and sponsors. That would be Buds Group, a consulting group out of the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and also the Maverick PR Group out of Colorado. So for everyone here at WPCM TV and the NCIA, I thank you for listening. I thank you for watching, and please remember to like, share, and subscribe.